My name is Clara, 33 years old, and I work as a financial manager for a major tech firm in Chicago. The greatest wedding gift you could possibly give me is to disappear from this family forever. My sister Madison sneered at me through the mirror of the luxury bridal boutique. My mother looked away, pretending to inspect a piece of lace. My father simply crossed his arms and nodded in agreement. I did not cry or beg for their love. Instead, I smiled, agreed to their terms, and did exactly that. But before I vanished, I sold the mansion they were living in out from under them and stripped away every financial safety net I had ever provided. What I left behind in that empty house completely destroyed their fake reality. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to cut ties with toxic relatives who only loved you for your bank account. Growing up in the affluent suburbs of Chicago, our family dynamic was rigid and brutally clear. Madison, who was 5 years younger than me, was the undisputed golden child. She was currently a social media influencer with 300,000 followers, building an entire brand on an aesthetic of unearned wealth and performative perfection. I was the scapegoat. I was the quiet, logical achiever who was expected to fund the lavish lifestyle my parents and sister felt they inherently deserved. They treated my financial success not as an achievement to be proud of, but as a communal family resource to be drained at their convenience. The ultimate confrontation happened on a crisp Tuesday afternoon at an exclusive bridal boutique on the Magnificent Mile. The shop smelled of expensive vanilla candles and imported silk. I was standing in the center of the plush viewing room, holding a custom French lace veil that I had just put on my own credit card. Madison was standing on the viewing pedestal, admiring herself in a $15,000 beaded gown. She had demanded I pay for the veil because her wedding budget was supposedly stretched tight. I handed over my card as I always did, playing the role of the reliable, boring older sister who fixed everyone's problems. But when I politely asked her if she had finalized the catering numbers for the venue, she rolled her eyes dramatically. She told me to stop nagging her about spreadsheets and logistics. I reminded her that since I had fronted the massive $65,000 deposit for the venue from my own savings, the caterers needed a final headcount by the end of the day, or we would incur heavy penalties. That was when she delivered the line. She looked at my reflection in the floor-to-ceiling mirror, her perfectly contoured face twisting into a look of pure disgust. The greatest wedding gift you could possibly give me is to disappear from this family forever. You are just a sad, single reminder of everything I do not want to be. I stood frozen for a fraction of a second. I looked toward the plush velvet sofa where my mother, Susan, was casually sipping complimentary champagne. "Mom," I said quietly, "are you going to say anything about that?" Susan adjusted her posture deliberately, turning her head away to pretend to examine a rack of bridesmaid dresses. She took another sip of champagne. "Madison is under a lot of stress, Clara. Stop trying to make this day about you." My father, Richard, who had been aggressively ignoring the tension all morning, finally chimed in. He let out a loud, exaggerated sigh. "Clara, your negative energy is completely ruining this bridal fitting. Why do you always have to bring down the mood? We are trying to celebrate your sister." A normal person might have broken down right there. A normal sister might have wept or begged for their love. But I had spent 33 years begging for scraps of affection from a family that only saw me as a walking ATM. In that perfectly lit, vanilla-scented room, something inside me finally snapped shut. The desperation for their approval evaporated entirely, replaced by a cold, calculating logic. I smiled. It was a sharp, terrifying smile that caused Madison to visibly falter on her pedestal. "You are absolutely right," I said, keeping my voice smooth and perfectly level. "I will disappear. I will step out of your wedding, out of your photos, and out of your life entirely. But if I am no longer part of this family, I am no longer this family's bank. I want my money back. Every single cent. Right at that moment, the heavy glass doors of the viewing room swung open. Darnell strutted in, holding a cup of artisan coffee. Darnell was Madison's fiancé, an African-American man who worked as a marketing director for a trendy streetwear brand. He always dressed in impeccably tailored suits, mixed with high-end sneakers, projecting the image of a wealthy, successful executive. He walked over to Madison, wrapped his arm around her waist protectively, and glared at me. "What is the problem now, Clara?" Darnell asked, his tone dripping with condescension. "Are you stressing out my future wife again with your boring accountant talk? You financial managers are all the same, stiff, boring, and loveless. You cannot stand seeing Madison actually happy." I did not flinch. I slowly walked over to my leather briefcase resting on the velvet armchair. I opened the brass clasps and pulled out a meticulously organized ledger. I am not an accountant, Darnell. I am a financial manager, which means I know exactly where every dollar goes. And right now, I am looking at the $65,000 I transferred from my personal savings account to secure your luxury wedding venue on Lake Michigan. I want it back, right now. The color drained from Madison's face. "You cannot do that. You promised to cover the venue deposit. It was a gift. A gift implies I am part of the family." I replied evenly. "You just publicly requested my permanent disappearance. I am happy to oblige, but my $65,000 is coming with me today." Madison began to hyperventilate. Her carefully crafted influencer persona cracked under the sudden threat of financial ruin. "You are a monster!" she screamed, stepping down from the pedestal. "If you cancel that venue, I will ruin you. I will go live to my 300,000 followers right now and tell them what a toxic, jealous, unsupportive sister you are. I will destroy your reputation." Darnell scoffed, trying to play the part of the unbothered rich groom. He puffed out his chest and waved his hand dismissively. "Let her take her money, Maddie. 65 grand is pocket change to a man of my status. We do not need her pathetic savings. I will cover the venue myself by the end of the day." I looked Darnell dead in the eyes. I knew his aesthetic was built entirely on maxed-out credit cards and borrowed prestige. "Is it pocket change, Darnell?" I asked sharply. "Because according to the venue coordinator, you tried to run 3 different credit cards for the catering deposit last week, and all 3 declined." Darnell froze. His jaw tightened, and he completely avoided my gaze. I stepped forward, holding the ledger up. "If it is pocket change, wire me the $65,000 right this second. Pull out your phone, open your banking app, and wire the funds. If you do, I will walk out of here, and you will never see me again." The silence in the boutique was deafening. The sales attendants had quietly vanished into the back room to avoid the crossfire. Darnell stood completely still, his phone securely in his pocket. He did not move. He did not speak. The facade of the wealthy streetwear executive was cracking right in front of my parents. Susan jumped up from the velvet sofa, her champagne spilling onto the pristine carpet. "Clara, you are being ridiculous!" she shrieked. "How dare you embarrass Darnell like this? You are just a jealous spinster trying to ruin the most important day of your sister's life because no man will ever look at you the way Darnell looks at Madison." Richard stepped between me and Darnell, pointing a shaking finger at my face. "Listen to me very carefully, Clara. If you pull the funding for this venue, I will formally disown you. You will be dead to this family." I looked at my father, taking in his red face and his empty threats. "You cannot disown someone who just quit, Dad." I reached back into my briefcase and pulled out a single sheet of paper. I had drafted it weeks ago when I first felt uneasy about fronting the money, but I had hoped I would never need to use it. It was a legally binding promissory note for the $65,000, complete with a clause that allowed me to place a lien on Darnell's assets if unpaid. "Sign this," I commanded, placing a silver pen on top of the document. "Both of you, Richard and Darnell, sign the promissory note acknowledging the debt and legally binding you to repay me within 30 days. If you do not sign it right now, I will call the venue, cancel the reservation, and let them know that the illustrious Darnell and the wealthy Madison cannot afford to pay their own bills. The venue will cancel your date immediately, and your precious social media followers will find out you are faking your entire lifestyle." Madison burst into loud, theatrical sobs. She begged Darnell to fix it. Darnell looked at the paper, his hands shaking slightly. He realized he was entirely cornered. Without my money, the wedding was dead. Without the wedding, his prestigious image was dead. He snatched the pen and aggressively scribbled his signature across the bottom line. Richard grabbed the pen next, glaring at me with pure hatred as he signed his name as a guarantor. "You are a cold, heartless bitch," Richard spat as he threw the pen on the glass table. "Do not ever call us again." I carefully picked up the signed document, blew on the ink to dry it, and slid it back into my briefcase. Then I reached into my coat pocket. I pulled out the heavy brass key to my $900,000 house, the house I had allowed Madison and Darnell to use as their temporary, pre-wedding headquarters so they could film aesthetic content for her channel. I dropped the key onto the glass table. It landed with a loud, final clack. "I will give you 24 hours to get your cheap ring lights and your fake designer luggage out of my property," I said. "Enjoy the wedding." I turned and walked out of the boutique. The crisp Chicago wind hit my face as I stepped onto the pavement. I walked to my car, got into the driver's seat, and closed the door. I sat there in the quiet isolation of my vehicle. There were no tears. There was no shaking. I felt an incredible, overwhelming sense of liberation. I opened my laptop right there in the driver's seat and connected to my mobile hotspot. The time for being the reliable bank account was over. The time for absolute consequences had begun. I opened my email and drafted an urgent message to my real estate broker. I instructed him to list my house immediately for a fast cash sale, even if it meant taking a slight loss. I wanted it sold and transferred within 48 hours. Next, I logged into my banking portal. With a few swift clicks, I canceled the automatic payments for my parents' premium health insurance plan. I navigated to the auto loan portal and canceled the monthly payments for the luxury SUV my mother drove, a vehicle she proudly claimed my father had bought for her. I stripped them of every financial safety net I had quietly provided for years. I closed the laptop, started the engine, and merged into the heavy city traffic, leaving my old life entirely in the rearview mirror. 48 hours later, the illusion of their perfect lives was still running on borrowed time. I had spent those 2 days orchestrating a financial demolition so precise it would leave no room for negotiation. My real estate broker, a shark of a man who loved a fast cash deal, had already found a buyer for my $900,000 property. A corporate investment firm looking for immediate rental inventory bought it for cash, 20% under market value, signing the paperwork in record time. The house was no longer mine. It belonged to a faceless corporation, and the funds were securely sitting in my private offshore account. Back at that same house, Madison and Darnell were completely oblivious to the legal trap closing around them. They had moved their designer luggage and ring lights into the grand foyer, treating my property like a luxurious movie set for their pre-wedding content. Madison immediately went live on social media. I watched the broadcast from the safety of my downtown hotel suite, sipping a black coffee as her face filled my screen. She was standing in my custom-designed kitchen, wearing a pristine white silk robe with bride embroidered across the back in silver thread. Welcome to our new chapter, you guys, Madison cooed into her phone camera, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. Darnell and I are officially moving into our marital mansion. It is so crazy how everything just falls into place when you manifest positive energy. My single older sister decided to graciously step aside and let us have the space. She knew we needed a home that matched our aesthetic, and honestly, she just did not fit the vibe here anyway. The live chat flooded with heart emojis and comments praising Madison for her beautiful new home. Darnell swaggered into the frame, wearing a tailored suit jacket over a designer graphic tee. He wrapped his arms around Madison, kissing her cheek, while making sure his expensive watch caught the ring light's glare. He looked straight into the camera, flashing a brilliant, arrogant smile. "When you work as hard as we do, you get to play hard," Darnell told the thousands of viewers. "This house is just the beginning. I always promised my queen I would put her in a castle, and here we are, nothing but the best for the future Mrs. Darnell." I took a slow sip of my coffee, feeling a profound sense of satisfaction. Darnell was playing the victorious king of the castle, but his kingdom was built on sand. As the live stream continued, a mail carrier walked up the front steps and dropped a thick stack of envelopes through the mail slot. Madison, eager to show off her new domestic life, carried the phone to the foyer and picked up the mail on camera. Most of it was junk, but 3 envelopes bore bright red final notice stamps. They were addressed to Darnell. Madison barely glanced at them. She laughed, tossing the red envelopes directly into the decorative fireplace. "Just some boring old tenant mail," she told her followers, with a dismissive wave of her perfectly manicured hand. "We are going to have to get the post office to forward all the old trash. This is our sanctuary now." She had no idea she had just burned final demands from aggressive debt collectors. She assumed my wealth would somehow automatically cover the home's expenses, or that her wealthy fiancé had it all under control. Her arrogance blinded her to the reality of Darnell's financial decay. The truth was, Darnell was not a successful streetwear executive. He was a cripplingly addicted gambler who owed violent bookies in suburban Indiana a massive fortune. He had secretly forged Madison's signature to take out a high-interest, subprime mortgage loan, using my property address as collateral, in a convoluted scheme to buy himself more time. He assumed he could leverage my assets to pay off his dangerous debts. But because I had just sold the house out from under them, his collateral was gone. His safety net was obliterated. The clock ran out exactly at noon. I watched on the live stream as the heavy oak front door swung open. Madison gasped, dropping her phone slightly so the camera angled up at the ceiling. A crew of 8 men in industrial coveralls marched into the grand foyer. They were not wedding planners or florists. They were a commercial cleanout crew I had hired at double the standard rate for absolute efficiency. "Excuse me?" Madison shrieked, her influencer voice completely vanishing. "Who are you people? You cannot just walk into my house. We are streaming live to 300,000 people right now. Get out!" The crew foreman, a massive man holding a clipboard, did not even blink. "We are authorized by the new property management company, ma'am. This house was sold yesterday. We are here to strip the staging furniture and clear the premises for the corporate buyer. You have exactly 1 hour to vacate before we call the police for trespassing." The camera feed captured Darnell rushing into the foyer, his fake confidence instantly evaporating. "Sold," Darnell yelled, his voice cracking. "That is impossible. This is my fiancé's family home. We have a right to be here." The foreman handed Darnell a copy of the deed transfer. "Read the paperwork, buddy. You have 0 rights here. Now move your camera gear before we throw it on the lawn." Madison frantically ended the live stream, plunging my screen into darkness. Right on cue, my phone rang. The caller ID flashed my mother's name. I let it ring 3 times before calmly pressing accept. "Clara, what the hell is going on?" Susan screamed into the receiver, her voice shrill with panic. Madison just called me, crying hysterically. She says a bunch of thugs are throwing her wedding dresses out onto the driveway. Did you actually sell the house? I did, I replied smoothly. I sold it for cash. They are currently trespassing on corporate property. You are a monster, my mother roared. How could you do this to your own sister 2 days before her wedding? Where are they supposed to go? They sent out invitations with that address for the morning preparations. You are publicly humiliating our family. I leaned back in my hotel chair, entirely unbothered by her screaming. I am just granting your wish, Mom. You told me to disappear. I disappeared. And I took my $900,000 house with me. Besides, Madison signed a 24-hour short-term lease when she blindly signed those catering cancellation forms at the boutique. She just was not smart enough to read the fine print. Her lease expired at noon today. My father's voice suddenly boomed through the speakerphone. Clara, you listen to me right now. You are going to call those movers off. You are going to let Darnell and Madison stay in that house until the wedding is over. Do you hear me? You are embarrassing us in front of Darnell's entire corporate network. I laughed softly, a genuine cold chuckle that made the silence on the other end of the line deafening. Darnell does not have a corporate network, Dad. He is a fraud. He forged Madison's signature on a subprime loan, and he is drowning in gambling debts. I suggest you go pick up your golden child from the curb before the police arrive. I hung up the phone. Back at the empty house, absolute chaos was erupting. Stripped of my furniture, the barren living room echoed with shouting. Susan and Richard had rushed over to rescue Madison, demanding answers from Darnell. With the facade shattered, Darnell dropped his gentlemanly act completely. His phone had been ringing endlessly with threats from the subprime lender, who just discovered the collateral was gone. Cornered and desperate, Darnell viciously turned on my parents. He mocked their fake suburban wealth, calling them desperate social climbers. Then he delivered his brutal ultimatum. Either Susan and Richard liquidated their own retirement accounts to hand him $100,000 in cash by tomorrow, or he would leave Madison at the altar and let her explain the forged loans and his gambling debts to her hundreds of thousands of followers. Absolute desperation set in. The family realized they had backed the wrong horse and alienated their only true lifeline. Madison, hyperventilating and terrified of internet cancellation, swallowed her pride and dialed my number. I answered on the first ring. Clara, please, Madison sobbed, her voice raw with panic. Darnell is out of control. We need money. Please, I am sorry for what I said at the boutique. We can go back to being a family. I just need a bailout. I listened to the frantic apologies, the sobbing, and the begging. I did not offer a single word of comfort. I simply laughed, hung up the phone, and blocked her number permanently. The trap had fully snapped shut, leaving them entirely tangled in the web of their own vanity. I turned back to my laptop and began preparing the grand finale for their live-streamed wedding. I turned on my heel and walked out of the viewing room, ignoring Susan's shrill screams demanding I come back. I walked through the elegant boutique doors and stepped out onto the bustling Chicago pavement. The crisp, icy wind hit my face, but I felt warmer than I had in years. I walked to my car, parked down the street, unlocked it, and slid into the driver's seat. The silence of the vehicle wrapped around me. I looked at myself in the rearview mirror. I was entirely tearless. There was no grief, no regret, only a profound, razor-sharp clarity. I pulled my laptop from my bag and rested it on the steering wheel. With a few clinical, precise keystrokes, the true erasure began. My first email was marked urgent to my real estate broker. List the house immediately, I typed. Fast cash sale, below market value. I want a corporate buyer by tomorrow morning. Do whatever it takes to close the deal fast. Next, I logged into my banking portal. I navigated to my scheduled transfers. I clicked on the auto pay for my parents' premium health insurance plan. Cancel. I watched the confirmation screen flash green. I scrolled down to the exorbitant lease payments for Susan's luxury SUV, the car she flaunted at her country club. Cancel. Another green flash. I found the monthly allowance transfer I sent to my father to cover his golf memberships and dining expenses. Cancel. I systematically dismantled every financial safety net they had blindly relied on for the past decade. The family that had told me to disappear was about to learn exactly how expensive my absence would be. I closed the laptop, put the car in gear, and drove away into the city. Thinking they had won a total victory, Madison and Darnell wasted no time claiming their prize. Less than 2 hours after I drove away, they pulled up to my $900,000 property in a rented luxury SUV. They unloaded designer luggage, carrying it through the mahogany doors with the swagger of conquering royalty. In their minds, my silent departure meant I had surrendered. They believed my threat to evict them was just a bluff. To them, my home was now their ultimate pre-wedding headquarters, an aesthetic backdrop perfectly suited for their manufactured online personas. The house was an architectural masterpiece in Chicago. It featured soaring vaulted ceilings, custom hardwood floors, and a chef's kitchen gleaming with white marble. I spent 3 years designing every square inch to reflect my hard-earned success. Madison, however, saw it only as a prop. Within minutes of arriving, she had her ring light set up in the foyer. She adjusted her pristine white silk robe, fluffed her highlighted hair, and tapped the screen of her phone to go live to her 300,000 followers. "Welcome to our new chapter, you guys," Madison cooed into her phone camera, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Darnell and I are officially moving into our marital mansion. It is honestly so crazy how everything just falls into place when you manifest positive energy and stay true to your vision." She walked through the house, turning the camera to showcase the expensive artwork and custom furniture I paid for with my own sweat and tears. The live chat instantly flooded with heart emojis, praising Madison for her stunning new home. Followers begged for decorating tips and asked how she and Darnell managed to afford such an incredible estate at their age. My single older sister graciously stepped aside and let us have the space for the wedding week. Madison continued framing her blatant theft as a charitable donation. She knew we needed a home that matched our aesthetic, and honestly, she just did not fit the vibe here anyway. We are so blessed to be upgrading our lifestyle just in time for the ceremony. Darnell swaggered into the frame on cue. He wore a tailored suit jacket over a high-end graphic tee, playing the role of the wealthy fiancé to absolute perfection. He wrapped his arms around Madison from behind, kissing her cheek, while making sure his counterfeit watch caught the glare of the ring light. He looked straight into the camera, flashing an arrogant smile that hid the desperate reality of his actual life. "When you work as hard as we do, you get to play hard," Darnell told the thousands of viewers watching the stream. "This house is just the beginning for us. I always promised my queen I would put her in a castle, and here we are. Nothing but the best for the future Mrs. Darnell." They fed off each other's delusions, completely intoxicated by the validation pouring in from strangers on the internet. They walked through my living room, pointing out the imported rugs, claiming every piece of my success as their own. Madison spun around the kitchen island, laughing and posing, totally disconnected from the fact that her temporary lease on this fantasy was ticking down to 0. As the live stream continued, the heavy thud of the mail slot echoed through the foyer. A postal worker had just dropped off the afternoon delivery. Madison, eager to show off her new domestic life and play the busy homeowner, carried her phone toward the front door. She picked up the thick stack of envelopes on camera, ready to joke about wedding RSVPs or bridal registry gifts. Instead, the stack was heavy with aggressive, brightly colored envelopes. They were not addressed to me, the actual homeowner. They were addressed directly to Darnell. 3 of the envelopes bore bright red, bold stamps reading, "Final notice and immediate action required." They were from aggressive collection agencies and subprime lenders, entities that did not care about social media aesthetics or wedding week vibes. Madison stared at the red letters for a fraction of a second, a brief flash of confusion crossing her face, but the camera was still rolling, and 300,000 people were watching her every move. She could not let reality interrupt her broadcast. She could not let her followers see the cracks in Darnell's wealthy facade. Believing my immense wealth would somehow automatically cover whatever minor expenses these letters represented, or simply arrogant enough to completely ignore reality, Madison made a swift decision. She laughed, a bright, bubbly sound that completely masked her momentary panic. "Just some boring old tenant mail," she told her followers with a dismissive wave of her hand, intentionally mischaracterizing the urgent debt collection notices. "We are going to have to get the post office to forward all this old trash. This is our sanctuary now, and we only allow good vibes in this house." Without another word, she marched over to the decorative gas fireplace in the center of the living room. Still holding the phone with one hand, she carelessly tossed the entire stack of final notice letters onto the unlit ceramic logs. She dusted her hands off on camera, smiling brightly as if she had just performed a charming household chore. She had absolutely no idea she had just thrown away the final demands from aggressive lenders and furious creditors. She assumed my bank accounts were still an open safety net, ready to catch them whenever they fell. Her boundless arrogance blinded her to the catastrophic reality of Darnell's financial decay. The truth was, those letters were the ticking time bomb of Darnell's secret life. A life built entirely on staggering gambling debts and massive high-interest loans. By tossing those warnings into the fireplace, Madison sealed her own fate, entirely unaware that the real owner of the house had already pulled the plug on their perfect, manufactured world. The pristine quiet of their stolen sanctuary shattered exactly at noon. Madison was busy adjusting her expensive ring light in the grand foyer, preparing for a second live stream to showcase my imported Italian leather sofas to her eager followers. Darnell was lounging on one of those very sofas, scrolling through his phone with a smug, entitled expression. Neither of them noticed the convoy of heavy, unmarked box trucks pulling into the circular driveway until a sharp, authoritative knock hammered against the solid mahogany front door. Madison hurried to answer it, wearing her pristine white bridal robe and a bright camera-ready smile, fully expecting a delivery of wedding gifts or luxury floral arrangements. Instead, she found herself staring at a massive crew of 12 men in matching industrial uniforms. The foreman, a burly man with a clipboard and absolutely zero patience for influencer aesthetics, did not wait for an invitation. He stepped right past Madison, his heavy work boots leaving dusty scuff marks on the foyer tiles, and signaled his team to follow. They flooded into the house like a coordinated military strike, moving with terrifying, silent efficiency. "Excuse me?" Madison shrieked, her voice pitching into a panicked squeal as 4 men bypassed her and marched directly into the living room. "You cannot just walk in here! This is private property. We are filming a wedding documentary." Darnell leaped off the leather sofa, puffing his chest out to intimidate the workers. He shouted at them to get out before he called the police, playing the role of the fierce, protective groom. The foreman ignored Darnell entirely. He pulled a thick stack of work orders from his clipboard and shoved it directly into Darnell's chest. "Read it and weep, buddy," the foreman grunted, his tone completely flat. "We are contracted by the new corporate owners. The property was sold, the closing was expedited, and our orders are to strip this place down to the drywall. Every piece of furniture, every rug, every painting belongs to the previous owner, and it is all going into storage. Now step aside before you get hurt." Madison watched in absolute horror as 2 workers effortlessly lifted the $10,000 leather sofa Darnell had just been lounging on and carried it right out the front door. Another team rolled up the Persian rugs, exposing the bare hardwood floors underneath. The beautiful, curated aesthetic Madison had promised her 300,000 followers was being systematically dismantled right in front of her eyes. The house, once filled with warmth and luxury, quickly transformed into a hollow, echoing shell. Every footstep now amplified against the bare walls. Darnell stood frozen, holding the work order, his counterfeit confidence evaporating as the reality of his powerlessness set in. He was not a king. He was an imposter, standing in an empty room. Unable to stop the professional movers, Madison grabbed her phone and dialed the only people she thought could save her. Less than 5 minutes later, my phone vibrated on the desk of my luxury hotel suite. I was sitting by the window, looking out over the Chicago skyline, enjoying the absolute tranquility of my new life. The caller ID flashed my father's name. I let it ring 3 times, savoring the delay before calmly pressing accept. "Clara, what in the name of God is going on over there?" My father Richard roared through the speakerphone, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and sheer panic. "Susan," my mother was yelling in the background, demanding he put the call on speaker. "Clara!" my mother screamed, her voice shrill enough to cut glass. "Madison just called us in absolute hysterics. She said a gang of thugs just broke into your house, and they are stealing all the furniture. They took the sofa right out from under Darnell. You need to call the police right now." "Tell them it is a mistake. Stop whatever sick game you are playing. They are getting married in 2 days, and they need that house for their photos." I took a slow, deliberate sip of my iced water. My voice, when I finally spoke, was icy measured and completely devoid of emotion. "There is no mistake, Mom," I replied smoothly, "and I am not playing a game. I am executing a legally binding real estate transaction. I sold the property 48 hours ago, for cash. The new buyers are a corporate investment firm, and they requested the property be delivered entirely vacant. Those are not thugs. They are bonded, insured professionals hired to move my personal assets into a climate-controlled storage facility. The house does not belong to me anymore, and it certainly never belonged to Madison or Darnell. But you told her she could stay there for the week," Susan sputtered, grasping at straws as the reality of the situation crashed down on her. "You gave her the key at the boutique. You cannot just evict your own sister without notice." "I did not evict her without notice," I corrected sharply, leaning into the microphone. "I simply held her to the exact terms of the agreement she signed. When I handed Madison that fixed stack of catering cancellation forms and vendor waivers at the bridal boutique, I slipped a short-term lease agreement into the middle of the pile. She was so busy screaming at me and worrying about her precious live stream that she blindly signed every single page without reading a single word. That document granted her temporary tenant access for exactly 24 hours. That lease expired precisely at noon today. She is no longer a guest. She is trespassing on corporate property. If she and Darnell do not vacate the premises before my moving crew finishes loading the trucks, the new owners will absolutely have them arrested." There was a brief, stunned silence on the other end of the line, broken only by the sound of my father taking a sharp intake of breath. Then the phone was violently snatched away. Madison's voice ripped through the speaker, distorted by hysterical, uncontrollable sobbing. "Clara, you cannot do this to me!" she shrieked, her voice echoing painfully against the newly bare walls of the empty house, creating a haunting backdrop to her desperation. "My followers are expecting a full Architectural Digest home tour tomorrow. The lighting in here is ruined. The aesthetic is completely gone. I have sponsorships lined up that require a luxury background. You are destroying my brand. You are ruining my entire wedding week." I listened to her wail the sound of her superficial kingdom collapsing, bringing me a deep, resonant peace. She was not crying about losing a home or losing her sister. She was crying because her internet aesthetic was ruined. She was mourning a fake life she never earned. Her screams bounced off the empty walls, highlighting exactly how hollow her entire existence truly was. I did not offer a single word of comfort or explanation. I let her listen to the quiet, steady rhythm of my breathing for a few moments, letting the weight of my complete indifference sink in. Then, with a simple tap of my finger, I ended the call. I sat in my hotel room watching the fallout through hidden security cameras I deliberately left in the foyer ventilation grates. The public livestream had officially ended, but my private broadcast was getting to the best part. The house was barren, entirely stripped of every single luxury that gave it warmth. Madison stood frozen in the empty room, her chest heaving as she stared at her phone screen. She was completely incapable of processing that I had actually hung up on her. The silence was heavy, broken only by the moving crew hauling my custom dining chairs out the front door. Then an aggressive buzzing noise shattered the quiet. It was Darnell's phone vibrating violently against the bare hardwood floor where he dropped his jacket earlier. Darnell flinched. He looked at the glowing screen, his face turning an ashen, sickly gray. He did not answer. The ringing stopped, but 2 seconds later, it started again. It was an angry, mechanical shriek, demanding immediate attention. Darnell snatched the device, glancing nervously at Madison, who was still too paralyzed by her ruined aesthetic to notice his mounting panic. He hurried toward the empty kitchen, swiping to accept the call and pressing the phone tightly against his ear. I turned up the volume on my secure feed. The acoustics of the empty house captured every word perfectly. Darnell was whispering, but his voice trembled with a raw terror that completely erased his confident streetwear executive persona. "Listen to me," I said. "I need 48 more hours," Darnell hissed into the receiver, pacing frantically across the marble tiles. "You cannot call me right now. I am in the middle of securing the asset." The voice on the other end was loud enough to bleed through the speaker. It was a representative from a notorious subprime mortgage lender, a company famous for predatory interest rates and absolute ruthlessness. The representative did not care about Darnell's timeline. The voice demanded immediate payment of a massive balloon installment that was 72 hours past due. "I am telling you the collateral is solid," Darnell pleaded, his free hand gripping his hair. "My fiancé owns this property. It is worth nearly $1 million free and clear. I just need a couple of days to finalize the leverage and pull the equity. You have the paperwork. You have her signature. The loan is fully secured by the estate." I leaned closer to my laptop screen, a cold smile touching my lips. This was the moment the slick, untouchable Darnell completely unraveled. The representative barked back, informing Darnell that they had just run a secondary title check. The property address listed on the loan application had just changed ownership. The collateral was gone. "No, no, no, that is impossible," Darnell stammered, his eyes darting wildly around the empty kitchen. "Her sister just pulled a stunt with some movers, but the house is ours. You have to give me until Monday. If you default this loan, the guys in Indiana are going to kill me. You know who holds my paper. You know what they do." The frantic confession spilled from his lips like a burst dam. The escalating conflict laid his true nature completely bare. Darnell was not a high-powered marketing director for a luxury brand. He was a cripplingly addicted gambler. He had spent the last 3 years drowning in massive sports betting losses, playing high-stakes games he could never afford. His tailored suits and counterfeit watches were just a desperate costume to attract a wealthy mark. He found his perfect, gullible victim in Madison. His debts were not owed to legitimate banks. They were owed to violent underground bookies operating out of suburban Indiana. These were men who did not send collection letters. They sent ruthless enforcers. To keep the Indiana bookies from breaking his legs, Darnell had taken out a predatory loan from the subprime lender. But to secure that dangerous loan, he needed substantial collateral. So he secretly forged Madison's signature on a mountain of financial documents. He pledged my house as the primary asset, assuming Madison's status as my sister would grant them inevitable legal ownership, or at least enough leverage to fool the underwriters. He banked his entire survival on my passive compliance and my property. Now that I sold the house out from under them for cash, Darnell's collateral was completely erased. The lender was officially recalling the loan, which meant the Indiana bookies were going to come collecting their pound of flesh before the wedding bells ever rang. "Please, you have to work with me," Darnell begged, his voice cracking into a pathetic whimper. "I am getting married in 2 days. The wedding gifts alone will cover the interest. Just do not call the note. If you call the note, I am dead." He was so consumed by his terror that he did not hear the soft rustle of silk behind him. Madison had quietly wandered into the kitchen, desperately looking for her fiancé, to comfort her over the lost furniture. She stopped dead in her tracks, just a few feet away from him. The empty, echoing walls of the kitchen acted like a megaphone. Madison heard every single word. She heard the begging. She heard the admission of the forged signature. She heard about the Indiana bookies and the subprime loan secured by a house they never even owned. Madison stood frozen, her pristine white bridal robe suddenly looking like a tragic costume. The phone slipped from her fingers and crashed onto the marble floor. The sharp crack echoed through the house, causing Darnell to spin around violently. He dropped his phone, his eyes locking onto Madison's horrified face. The truth hit her like a runaway freight train, completely obliterating her manufactured reality. Her wealthy, protective groom was a desperate criminal fraud, and her perfect internet life was nothing but a fragile house of cards that had just been incinerated. Madison's scream tore through the barren kitchen, a sound so raw and guttural it barely sounded human. She lunged at Darnell, her perfectly manicured hands curling into fists as she struck his chest in a blind panic. Darnell did not even try to comfort her. He grabbed her wrists, shoving her backward with a rough, callous force that sent her stumbling against the bare marble counter. The loving, protective fiancé vanished in an instant, replaced by a cornered animal willing to tear apart anyone in his path to survive. "You forged my signature!" Madison shrieked, her chest heaving, as tears ruined her flawless makeup. "You leveraged my sister's house to pay off bookies. You are completely broke. You have absolutely nothing." Before Darnell could silence her, the heavy mahogany front door banged open. Susan and Richard burst into the foyer completely out of breath. They had sped over the moment I hung up on them, expecting to find moving crews to yell at or police officers to bribe. Instead, they walked into a cavernous, echoing shell of a house and a vicious domestic dispute. Susan froze, her eyes widening as she took in the stripped living room, the bare hardwood floors, and the absolute absence of the luxury she loved to claim as family property. Then she saw Madison, sobbing hysterically against the kitchen counter, and Darnell standing over her with his fists clenched at his sides. "What in the world is happening here?" Richard roared, marching into the kitchen with forced bravado. "Where is the furniture? Why is Clara saying the house is sold? And why is my daughter crying?" Susan rushed to Madison's side, wrapping her arms around the trembling bride-to-be. "Darnell, explain yourself right now," Susan demanded, using her shrill country club voice of authority. "What did you do to her? Why are you letting Clara disrespect us like this? We told you to handle her." Darnell looked at my parents, his eyes cold and dead. The slick, gentlemanly facade he had meticulously maintained for the past 2 years dissolved completely. He let out a harsh, barking laugh that echoed uncomfortably against the bare walls. "Stop acting like you are royalty." Susan Darnell spat, his voice dripping with pure venom. "You people make me sick. You walk around with your designer bags and your leased cars, looking down your noses at everyone, acting like you are Chicago elite. You are nothing but desperate social climbers. You do not have a dime of real wealth. You relied entirely on Clara to fund your pathetic country club lifestyle, and the second she cut the cord, you came crashing down to reality. Richard stepped forward, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. "How dare you speak to us that way?" Richard yelled, pointing a shaking finger at Darnell. "You are marrying into this family. You owe us respect." "I do not owe you anything," Darnell snarled, stepping right into my father's personal space, forcing Richard to instinctively back away. "In fact, you owe me. The truth is out. I am drowning in debt. I owe aggressive lenders a massive amount of money, and because your ungrateful older daughter just sold this house and destroyed my collateral, those lenders are coming for my blood. Madison's signature is on the subprime loan application. If I go down for fraud, your precious golden child goes down right beside me as a co-conspirator. The police will not care that she did not read what she signed. She is legally liable for every single cent." Susan gasped, clutching her chest as if she were having a heart attack. "You forged her name. You are a common criminal. We are calling the police right now and canceling this wedding. You will never see my daughter again." Darnell smiled, a chilling, predatory grin that made my mother physically recoil. "Go ahead, Susan," Darnell challenged, spreading his arms wide in open defiance. "Call the cops. Cancel the wedding. Let us see how your country club friends react when your daughter's groom is hauled away in handcuffs for fraud. Let us see how Madison's 300,000 internet followers react when they find out her entire luxury lifestyle is a total lie, funded by predatory loans and underground gambling debts. Cancel the wedding, and Madison will be the biggest laughingstock on the internet by tomorrow morning. Her brand will be permanently annihilated. Her sponsorships will drop her in an instant. Your entire family will be publicly crucified by the same people you spend your lives trying to impress." The silence that followed was suffocating. Susan and Richard stared at Darnell, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the scandal facing them. They valued their social status and Madison's internet fame above oxygen. Darnell knew exactly what game he was playing. He knew their deepest, most pathetic vulnerabilities, and he weaponized them perfectly. "Here is how this is going to work," Darnell continued, his voice dropping into a dangerous, commanding register. "You two are going to fix this. You are going to liquidate whatever pathetic retirement accounts you actually have left. You are going to sell Susan's jewelry, max out your credit cards, and do whatever it takes to get me $100,000 in cash by tomorrow morning to satisfy the bookies." $100,000. Richard choked out, his knees visibly buckling under the weight of the demand. "We do not have that kind of liquid cash. We would have to empty our entire life savings. We would have nothing left for ourselves." "Then you better start making withdrawals," Richard Darnell snapped coldly, showing absolutely no mercy for the parents he had spent years sweet-talking. "Because if I do not have $100,000 in my hand by tomorrow morning to pay off the violent men looking for me, there will be no wedding. I will walk away. I will leave Madison standing alone at the altar. I will let the creditors come after her for the forged loan. I will let her explain her complete humiliation to the world. Your social standing will be ash. You have exactly 24 hours to figure this out. Now go." With those final venomous words, Darnell turned on his heel and stormed out of the kitchen. The heavy front door slammed shut behind him, the sound reverberating through the hollow, furnitureless house like a judge's gavel, sealing their doom. Susan, Richard, and Madison were left standing in the center of the bare marble floor, completely paralyzed by the sheer gravity of their new reality. The luxurious, untouchable kingdom they thought they ruled had just been exposed as a terrifying extortion trap. Susan collapsed against the kitchen island, her hands covering her face as she let out a dry, wheezing sob. Her country club status, her perfectly curated social image, everything she valued more than her own flesh and blood, was on the verge of total annihilation. Richard stared blankly at the empty space where my custom dining table used to sit, his face pale and slick with a cold sweat. He mentally calculated the balances of his retirement accounts, his emergency funds, and his heavily leveraged credit cards. He realized, with a sickening drop in his stomach, that draining every last cent they owned would leave them destitute, facing their twilight years with absolutely nothing but massive debt. But the most profound realization hitting my parents was not just the impending financial ruin. It was the crushing, undeniable fact that they had actively chased away their only true lifeline. For years, I had been the silent, reliable vault that funded their delusions of grandeur. I had paid the leases, covered the insurance, and fronted the cash for their extravagant social performances. And just a few hours ago, in a bridal boutique filled with strangers, they had viciously demanded I disappear forever. They had backed a charismatic parasite over their own loyal daughter, and now that parasite was demanding their life savings. Madison remained frozen near the center of the room. Her phone, which had fallen to the floor during her violent confrontation with Darnell, suddenly chimed with a rapid succession of loud notifications. She knelt down with trembling knees and picked it up. Her screen was flooded with hundreds of messages and comments from her loyal followers. Her abrupt and chaotic exit from the live stream had sparked wild, uncontrollable speculation. Her followers were demanding to know what happened to the luxury house tour. Gossip channels were already tagging her, asking if the rumors of a break-in or an eviction were true. The internet, the very beast she had fed and worshipped to build her entire identity, was beginning to turn its hungry eyes toward her. The sheer terror of being canceled on social media gripped Madison's throat like a vice. She could practically see the incoming wave of public mockery, the immediate loss of her lucrative sponsorships, and the gleeful destruction of her flawless bridal brand. She could not let Darnell walk away and expose her as a total fraud. She needed the elaborate wedding to happen, to secure her aesthetic, and she needed the extortion debt paid immediately to keep the police from investigating the forged subprime loan. Absolute desperation set in, completely overriding whatever fragile pride Madison had left in her body. She looked at her parents, seeing only two broken, aging people who could not save her without destroying themselves. There was only one person powerful enough, wealthy enough, and capable enough to make a $100,000 nightmare vanish instantly. Madison opened her contacts and scrolled down to my name. Her hands shook so violently she almost dropped the phone again before finally pressing the green call button. She put the device on speaker mode so Susan and Richard could hear, wrapping her white silk bridal robe tightly around her shivering shoulders. Miles away, in my serene downtown hotel suite, I was sitting comfortably by the window, watching the Chicago city lights flicker to life against the darkening evening sky. My phone vibrated steadily on the glass table. I glanced at the glowing screen. Madison. I knew exactly why she was calling. The trap had perfectly closed around them. I picked up the phone, accepted the incoming call, and held the device to my ear without saying a single word. "Clara! Oh my God, Clara, please do not hang up on me!" Madison sobbed into the receiver, her voice completely devoid of her usual influencer arrogance. It was a raw, ugly, pathetic sound. "We are in so much trouble right now. Darnell is a complete fraud. He forged my name on a terrible loan. He owes very dangerous people $100,000 by tomorrow morning, or he is going to cancel the wedding and ruin me entirely. Clara, please, you have to help us." I remained entirely silent, listening to the frantic, ragged breaths echoing through the speaker. "I am so incredibly sorry for what I said to you at the boutique today," Madison begged, her words tumbling over each other in a frantic rush to secure a massive financial bailout. "I did not mean any of it. You are my sister. You are the only one who can fix this mess. Please just transfer the funds to Mom and Dad's account right now. I swear I will pay you back every penny. We can go back to being a real family. We will include you in everything from now on. Mom and Dad are crying right now." "We need you, Clara. We really need you." Susan's voice echoed faintly in the background, shrill and utterly desperate. "Tell her we love her so much, Madison. Tell her we will cut Darnell out of our lives right after the ceremony is over. Just beg her for the money." I sat perfectly still, absorbing the sheer magnitude of their transparent, disgusting manipulation. They did not love me. They did not regret the decades of emotional abuse or the vicious way they discarded me this morning. They were only apologizing because their fraudulent, vain little world was burning to the ground and they needed my wallet to put out the massive fire. They wanted me to buy their way out of a disaster they created, also Madison could keep playing pretend on the internet. I thought about the long, exhausting years I spent craving their validation. I thought about the endless financial sacrifices I made just to be allowed a seat at their toxic table. And then I looked at the beautiful, quiet luxury of my hotel room, entirely funded by my own brilliance and hard work. "Clara, please say something," Madison wailed, her voice cracking with pure, unadulterated terror. "Please tell me you will save us." I did not offer a single word of comfort. I did not scream or curse or demand a better apology. Instead, a deep, genuine amusement bubbled up inside my chest. I laughed. It was a low, resonant, effortless chuckle that slipped smoothly through the phone line. It was the pure sound of a woman who had finally and permanently detached herself from a lifetime of toxic chains. The laughter echoed in their empty, stripped-down house, completely chilling their blood. Before Madison could utter another desperate plea, I pulled the phone away from my ear. I tapped the red button, ending the call instantly. I opened the contact settings, selected Madison's number, and hit block. I repeated the exact same process for Susan and Richard. With a few simple taps on a glass screen, I severed the final ties. I left them standing in the dark hollow shell of my former home, entirely trapped in the inescapable web of their own vanity, while I finally stepped forward into my absolute freedom. The next 48 hours evaporated into a blur of frantic, silent desperation for my family, culminating in the morning of the wedding. The venue I had paid for sat majestically on the edge of Lake Michigan. It was a breathtaking architectural marvel of floor-to-ceiling glass, draped in tens of thousands of dollars worth of imported white orchids. Outside, the sky was a crisp blue, and the gentle waves provided a perfect backdrop. It was exactly the kind of ultra-luxurious aesthetic Madison had obsessively curated for her followers. But behind the closed mahogany doors of the VIP bridal suite, the reality was apocalyptic. Madison sat rigid in a plush, velvet styling chair. She looked absolutely ghastly. Her skin was a sickly, translucent gray, layered with expensive foundation that could not hide the deep, bruised circles under her eyes. She had not slept a single minute since I hung up the phone on her. She spent the night curled on the bare floor of my former house, watching her carefully constructed empire fracture. Now strapped into a custom $15,000 beaded gown that felt like a straitjacket, she was shaking so violently her makeup artist had to physically hold her chin steady. Susan paced the length of the bridal suite like a trapped animal. Her heavy silk mother-of-the-bride dress rustled aggressively with every sharp turn. She clutched a glass of champagne with a white-knuckled grip, occasionally peering out the massive window overlooking the venue's grand entrance. Her socialite facade had completely crumbled. She was hyperventilating, terrified that her wealthy friends in the reception hall downstairs would somehow smell the poverty and fraud radiating from her. Richard stood by the suite's heavy wooden door, checking his watch and wiping cold sweat from his forehead with a silk handkerchief. He had spent 2 days desperately calling every bank and retirement fund manager. He managed to scrape together a fraction of the extortion money Darnell demanded, completely liquidating his pension and taking out ruinous cash advances. He was officially broke, a financial ghost wearing a rented tuxedo. But the immediate, suffocating terror gripping the room was about time. The Grand String Quartet had been playing in the main hall for an hour. 500 of Chicago's elite guests were seated. Hundreds of thousands of Madison's followers were tuning into the scheduled live stream, filling the chat with impatient questions. And Darnell was 45 minutes late. Madison let out a sharp, breathless sob, digging her manicured nails into the armrests. "He is not coming," she whispered, her voice cracking with sheer panic. "He took whatever money you managed to get and ran. He left me here. Clara was right. The internet is going to eat me alive." Susan rushed over, gripping Madison's shoulders tightly. "Pull yourself together right now," Susan hissed, her voice vibrating with terrifying intensity. "You are going to walk down that aisle and smile for those cameras if it kills you. We did not sacrifice everything we have for you to break down. Darnell will be here." Richard suddenly let out a strangled gasp from his position by the window. His face drained of all remaining color. He pressed his hands against the thick glass, staring down at the valet courtyard below. "He is here!" Richard choked out, his voice barely audible. "But there is a massive problem." Susan abandoned Madison and sprinted to the window. Madison scrambled out of her styling chair, her heavy gown dragging across the floor as she rushed to look. Down in the pristine cobblestone courtyard bordered by immaculate hedges, a sleek black SUV had just jerked to a halt, bypassing the valet attendants entirely. Darnell stepped out of the driver's side. He was wearing his custom-tailored tuxedo, but his bow tie was undone and his jacket was completely rumpled. He looked frantic, his head swiveling wildly. Before Darnell could take 3 steps toward the entrance, a dark, heavy sedan pulled up aggressively, blocking his path. 2 men stepped out. They wore dark leather jackets and moved with a terrifying, predatory calmness that sharply contrasted with the elegant surroundings. These were not collection agents carrying clipboards. These were the enforcers from suburban Indiana. The larger of the 2 men closed the distance instantly, grabbing Darnell by the lapels of his expensive tuxedo and shoving him. Darnell's arms flailed, his slick bravado entirely eradicated. The second man stepped in close, blocking Darnell from the view of the valet staff, pressing something hard and unseen into Darnell's ribs. Up in the bridal suite, the silence was absolute and suffocating. Susan clapped a hand over her mouth to stifle a scream. Richard's knees buckled slightly, forcing him to lean heavily against the window frame. Madison stood paralyzed, watching the violent reality of her fiancé's criminal life unfold right on the doorstep of her fairy tale wedding. They could not hear the words being spoken down in the courtyard, but the body language was unmistakably clear. The enforcers were delivering a final, physical ultimatum. They wanted their money right this second, or the groom was not going to make it into the venue alive. Darnell was gesturing wildly, pointing up toward the building, clearly pleading for his life and promising that his wealthy new in-laws were inside with the cash. The situation had escalated from a hidden financial disaster to an imminent, violent public scene. Just yards away, beyond the heavy glass doors of the venue, 500 upper-class guests were sipping champagne and waiting for a romantic spectacle. Outside, blood was about to be spilled on the cobblestone. Susan turned slowly away from the window, her eyes wide with a feral, terrifying desperation. She looked at Richard, who was already reaching into the inner pocket of his tuxedo to pull out his checkbook and the thick envelope of cash he had drained from his life savings. The choice was brutally clear. They had to go down there and buy Darnell's life from criminals, or watch their daughter's perfect aesthetic turn into a highly publicized crime scene. Richard did not hesitate. He grabbed the thick envelope of cash from his breast pocket and bolted for the suite door. Susan followed close behind, her heavy silk dress swishing frantically. They bypassed the grand sweeping staircase, terrified of being spotted by the early arriving socialites sipping mimosas in the lobby. Instead, they forced open the heavy fire doors and sprinted down the concrete service stairwell. Their footsteps echoed violently against the cinder block walls, a pathetic soundtrack to their impending financial ruin. They burst out into a narrow, cramped service hallway that connected the venue kitchen to the valet courtyard. The air smelled of stale grease and diesel exhaust. Richard pushed open the metal service door, just in time to see the larger enforcer draw his fist back. "Wait!" Richard screamed, his voice cracking with sheer desperation. He stumbled into the sunlight, waving the thick envelope of cash above his head. "Stop! We have the money! We can pay his debt right now! Please, just let him go!" The enforcer paused, casting a cold, dead-eyed glance over his shoulder. He shoved Darnell roughly against the brick wall and turned his full, terrifying attention to my father. Darnell slumped forward, gasping for air, desperately attempting to smooth the lapels of his ruined tuxedo. Susan arrived seconds later, clutching the doorframe, her chest heaving as she took in the scene of her golden child's flawless groom, cowering like a beaten animal. The second enforcer stepped forward, snatching the thick envelope right out of Richard's trembling hands. He did not bother counting the bills. He simply weighed the envelope in his palm, feeling the thickness, and let out a harsh, mocking laugh. "This is light, old man," the enforcer growled, his voice deep and entirely devoid of mercy. "Darnell owes a massive balloon payment today. This envelope barely covers the interest he racked up this week. You need to produce the rest of the principal right now, or we are taking the groom for a ride. And trust me, he is not coming back for the cake cutting." Darnell looked at my father, his eyes wide with a frantic, selfish terror. "Give them everything!" Richard Darnell shouted, his voice cracking into a high-pitched squeal. "Empty the accounts! You promised Madison a perfect day! You cannot let them drag me away!" Richard was shaking so violently he could barely unlock his smartphone. His hands fumbled over the screen as he opened his primary banking application. He had already drained the majority of his liquid assets, but there was still a heavily penalized retirement account, a meager pension he and Susan had spent 30 years building. It was their ultimate safety net, their entire future security. Without it, they would be utterly destitute. "Do it," Richard Susan hissed from the doorway, her voice vibrating with a sick, twisted vanity. Her priority was not her husband's financial survival. Her priority was stopping the guests in the grand hall from looking out the floor-to-ceiling windows and witnessing this humiliating spectacle. "We cannot let Madison be embarrassed. Just pay the men and make them leave." Standing in that filthy service hallway, Richard initiated the wire transfer. He drained his entire pension fund, sending the absolute last of his life savings directly to an offshore account provided by the criminals. He watched the digital balance on his screen drop to 0. The confirmation screen flashed bright green, mocking the total eradication of his 30 years of hard work. But the enforcer shook his head. Still short, he grunted, crossing his massive arms. "You are missing 20,000. We need collateral to cover the spread before we walk away." Susan let out a strangled gasp. She unclasped her designer handbag, her fingers digging frantically through the silk lining. She pulled out a sleek leather document folder. Inside were the pink slips, the actual ownership deeds to both of their luxury vehicles. They had brought the documents with the delusional intention of using them to secure a fast, high-interest loan on Monday to cover the wedding vendor balances I had abruptly canceled. "Take the cars," Susan pleaded, thrusting the vehicle deeds into the enforcer's hands. "The SUV is a current year model. The sedan is barely driven. They are worth more than 20,000. Just take the deeds and get off this property. The enforcer inspected the pink slips, verifying the signatures. He looked at his partner, who gave a brief, satisfied nod. The larger man stepped back, releasing Darnell from his physical trap. Darnell stumbled forward, brushing dirt off his tailored pants, coughing and gasping for air. "You are clear for today," the enforcer said, slipping the vehicle deeds and the envelope of cash into his heavy leather jacket. "But the clock restarts on Monday. You better hope your new bride has deep pockets, Darnell. Enjoy the wedding." The two men turned and walked back to their dark sedan, pulling away from the valet courtyard without a single backward glance. They left my parents standing in the humid, grease-scented service alley. Susan and Richard were officially bankrupt. They had literally signed away their cars, their retirement, and their entire future stability. They were now penniless ghosts, having sacrificed their very survival just to maintain the fragile, fake illusion of a perfect wedding for their golden child. Richard leaned against the brick wall, his face buried in his hands, quietly sobbing. The magnitude of what he had just done crashed over him like an ocean wave. He had nothing left. Susan stared blankly at the empty driveway, her hands shaking at her sides, her socialite facade entirely hollowed out. They looked to Darnell, expecting him to fall to his knees in gratitude. They expected the man whose life they had just bought to thank them, to hug them, to promise he would make it right. Instead, Darnell adjusted his rumpled tuxedo jacket, pulling the collar straight. He ran his hands over his hair, checking his reflection in the tinted glass of the service door. He did not look at my parents with gratitude. He looked at them with profound annoyance.
"Pull yourselves together!"
Darnell snapped, his voice returning to its usual arrogant cadence. "You look absolutely pathetic. My groomsmen are waiting for me, and I need you two smiling for the cameras in 10 minutes. Do not ruin the vibe of my ceremony with those miserable faces." Without another word, without a single thank you or acknowledgement of their total financial sacrifice, Darnell pushed past Susan and walked through the heavy metal doors into the venue. He strutted toward the grand hall, ready to play the wealthy, triumphant groom. Susan and Richard were left standing alone in the alley, utterly destroyed, waiting to walk down an aisle they had just sold their souls to rent. Susan and Richard stepped out of the service alley, leaving their financial corpses behind. They moved like reanimated statues. Susan smoothed the wrinkles from her silk dress, forcing her trembling hands to steady. Richard stared straight ahead, his eyes dead, the reality of his empty bank accounts echoing in his chest. They had 3 minutes to rejoin high society and pretend they were the proud parents of a flawless bride. They slipped through a side corridor, entering the grand hall just as the heavy velvet curtains were drawn back. The ceremony space was a breathtaking masterpiece of manufactured romance. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of Lake Michigan. 50 rows of crystal chairs held 500 of Chicago's elite. Venture capitalists and wealthy socialites dressed in formal wear whispered quietly about the opulence. At the front of the room stood a massive LED screen projecting a looping video of white rose petals falling in slow motion. High-definition cameras were positioned at every strategic angle, manned by a professional production crew. The red recording lights blinked steadily, actively broadcasting the live stream to Madison's 300,000 loyal followers. The internet was watching, ready to consume the fairy tale. The string quartet shifted their melody, playing the opening notes of a bridal march. The heavy oak doors swung open. A collective gasp rippled through the audience as Madison stepped into the threshold. She was a vision of expensive lace, but the illusion stopped at her neckline. Behind the heavy layers of professional makeup, Madison was a portrait of pure terror. Her skin was ashen, her hands gripped her cascading bouquet so tightly her knuckles were white. She knew she was walking toward a man who forged her signature, a man whose life was just bought with her parents' destroyed pension fund. She was trapped by the blinking red lights of the cameras. She forced her lips into a rigid, trembling smile, playing the blushing bride, because the fear of online cancellation was stronger than her self-preservation. Richard stepped forward to take her arm. He offered no comforting words and did not smile. He locked his arm with hers and marched her down the white silk aisle runner like a man walking to his own execution. They moved past row after row of smiling guests, past the flashing cameras, and past Susan, who stood in the front row, desperately trying to control her hyperventilating. At the end of the aisle stood Darnell. He smoothed his rumpled tuxedo and adjusted his posture to project absolute, untouchable confidence. He watched Madison approach with a predatory, victorious smirk pulling at the corners of his mouth. He had won. He successfully extorted his future-in-laws, secured his physical safety, and was mere moments away from legally binding himself to a family he believed would shield him from his gambling debts. He did not look at Madison with love. He looked at her like a winning lottery ticket he was finally cashing in. Richard handed Madison off to Darnell, without a word stepping back to stand beside his ruined wife. Darnell took Madison's shaking, icy hand in his own, turning to face the priest. The string quartet allowed the final beautiful chord to fade into the vaulted ceiling. The hall settled into a reverent, expectant silence. The priest stepped up to the microphone, opening his leather-bound book. "Dearly beloved," the priest began, his deep voice echoing clearly through the sound system. "We are gathered here today in the presence of God, family, and friends to witness the joining of Darnell and Madison in holy matrimony. A union built on a foundation of absolute trust, unwavering honesty, and enduring love. Thousands of miles away, sitting in the pristine quiet of my luxury hotel suite, I watched the live broadcast on my primary monitor. I listened to the priest speak about honesty and trust, feeling a cold, brilliant satisfaction wash over me. My secondary monitor displayed the back-end interface of the wedding venue's audio-visual control system. The venue spared no expense on their screens and surround sound, but they utterly failed to secure their wireless network. It took me less than 20 minutes to bypass their basic firewall and gain total administrative access to the presentation software. I rested my finger over the Enter key on my laptop. I watched Darnell smiling proudly on the screen. I watched Madison trembling. I watched my parents sitting in the front row, completely oblivious to the final trap I had set. The time for being the silent, compliant bank account was officially over. The time for public, undeniable consequences had arrived. I pressed the Enter key with a sharp, definitive strike. Inside the grand hall, the priest opened his mouth to continue the ceremony, but his microphone emitted a piercing, high-pitched screech of audio feedback. The guests winced, raising their hands to cover their ears. The priest tapped the microphone, looking confusedly toward the sound booth at the back of the room. The production crew scrambled, frantically pushing buttons on their mixing boards, but their controls were entirely locked out. Then the soft acoustic ambient music playing faintly in the background cut out abruptly. The massive, expensive LED backdrop behind the altar, which had been displaying the gentle, falling white rose petals, suddenly glitched. The screen flashed violently, a rapid strobe of harsh static and digital noise that illuminated the horrified faces of the wedding party. Darnell spun around, dropping Madison's hand, his predatory smirk instantly vanishing. Madison let out a sharp cry, stumbling backward on the altar steps. The glitching screen went entirely pitch black for 3 agonizing seconds. The entire hall fell dead silent. The 300,000 viewers watching the live stream flooded the chat with question marks. Then the darkness on the screen shattered. A new image snapped into razor-sharp, high-definition focus across the entire wall. I had now completely hijacked the venue system, and my true presentation was officially live. The first slide illuminated the horrified faces of the wedding party with a stark, blinding white background. In massive, bold red lettering, the title read, "The Real Net Worth of Darnell." Beneath the title, a deeply negative balance flashed onto the screen, glowing in a terrifying crimson font. This was not a romantic montage. It was a forensic financial dismantling. A pie chart materialized, meticulously breaking down the groom's supposedly successful streetwear empire. Instead of profit margins and marketing budgets, the chart displayed hundreds of thousands of dollars in catastrophic gambling losses. I included screenshots of encrypted messages between Darnell and his violent creditors from suburban Indiana. The exact dates, the exact sports bets, and the exact amounts he owed were broadcast in high definition for the entire room to read. A collective echoing gasp rippled through the 500 elite guests seated in the crystal chairs. The venture capitalists in the front rows instinctively leaned forward, their eyes narrowing as they recognized the undeniable format of a verified financial audit. Darnell lunged toward the altar steps, waving his arms frantically at the audio-visual booth at the back of the hall. He screamed at the production crew to cut the power, his voice cracking in sheer panic, but they were completely locked out of the system. I controlled every pixel. Before Darnell could reach the power cables hidden behind the floral arrangements, the slide transitioned with a crisp, automated click. A high-resolution PDF of a subprime mortgage application filled the massive screen. I had highlighted the critical sections in bright yellow so no one in the back row could miss the details. The document clearly showed my former property address listed as the primary collateral. But the true devastation lay at the bottom of the page. I zoomed in on the signature line. Madison's name was scrawled across the digital paper. Right next to it, I placed a side-by-side comparison of Madison's actual, verified signature from her bridal boutique contracts. The forgery was glaringly obvious. A bold text overlay appeared on the screen reading, "Fraudulent loan secured by forgery." Madison let out a piercing shriek, clutching her head as she stared up at the undeniable proof of her fiancé's criminal activity. She realized instantly that her name was permanently attached to a federal crime. The perfectly curated bride collapsed onto the white silk aisle runner, her expensive dress pooling around her like a deflated parachute. Susan and Richard stood frozen in the front row, their mouths hanging open in silent horror. They had just emptied their entire retirement account to save a man who had actively framed their golden child for felony fraud. The priest, realizing he was standing in the middle of a massive criminal exposure, slowly backed away from the altar, closing his leather-bound book and shaking his head in absolute disbelief. The presentation did not pause for their grief. Another slide clicked into place, this one titled, "Who Actually Paid for the Aesthetic?" A cascade of bank statements and wire transfer receipts flooded the screen. I displayed the $65,000 venue deposit, the catering invoices, and the floral arrangements, all clearly showing my personal bank account as the sole source of funding. Next to my receipts, I projected a live, verified snapshot of Darnell's checking account, showing an available balance of less than $40. But the final nail in the coffin was a timeline of events that had occurred just 20 minutes prior. I displayed a security camera still from the venue's service alleyway, a camera I had accessed through the venue's compromised network. The grainy but clear image showed Richard handing over a thick envelope of cash to the leather-jacketed enforcers alongside the pink slips to their luxury vehicles. The caption read, "The parents of the bride buying the groom's life from bookies." The absolute poverty and desperation of my family were laid bare. The wealthy, untouchable facade they projected to their country club friends was completely incinerated in front of the exact people they spent their lives trying to impress. Susan buried her face in her hands, physically collapsing against Richard as the reality of their public humiliation destroyed her completely. The reaction inside the grand hall was instantaneous and ruthless. The elite guest people who valued reputation and financial stability above all else began whispering furiously. Smartphones shot up into the air from every single row. The wealthy socialites were not recording a romantic ceremony anymore. They were documenting the most spectacular social collapse in Chicago history. But the true bloodbath was happening online. The livestream interface, which I had mirrored onto the bottom corner of the giant screen, was exploding. The live chat moved at light speed. 300,000 followers went from posting heart emojis to unleashing a tidal wave of relentless mockery. Users typed out laughing emojis calling Darnell a broke scammer and Madison a gullible prop. The internet, the very beast Madison worshipped, turned its fangs on her without a second of hesitation. Comments rolled in, mocking her fake luxury lifestyle, pointing out that her entire brand was funded by her estranged sister and predatory loans. The hashtag #FraudBride began trending in the chat, spreading like wildfire across social platforms. The aesthetic she valued more than my actual presence in her life was permanently annihilated. Madison sat on the floor, surrounded by white orchids, staring blankly at the scrolling text of her own destruction. She had demanded I disappear to protect her perfect image, but in my absence, I had provided the brightest, most unforgiving spotlight imaginable. Darnell stood paralyzed near the altar, realizing that he was not just exposed to the guests. He was exposed to the police, the public, and every creditor watching the stream. Sitting in my hotel room miles away, I watched the destruction unfold with absolute chilling serenity. I took another sip of my coffee, feeling no guilt, no remorse, and no pity. They had actively chosen this path the moment they treated my financial support as an entitlement and my existence as a burden. The empire of lies they built to exclude me was now collapsing directly onto their heads, crushing their future under the weight of their own monumental vanity. Complete pandemonium broke out in the venue, shattering the elegant silence into 1,000 jagged pieces. The initial shock morphed into a chaotic frenzy of overlapping voices, angry shouting, and the relentless, rapid clicking of smartphone cameras. Madison let out a scream of pure, unadulterated horror, her knees completely buckling beneath her as the weight of her humiliation crashed down. She collapsed onto the pristine white silk aisle runner, her $15,000 beaded dress tangling awkwardly around her legs like a heavy, suffocating net. She clawed at the expensive fabric, gasping for air as if the room had suddenly been vacuumed of all oxygen. The glamorous aesthetic she had worshipped and prioritized over her own blood was dead. She was no longer a beautiful, envied bride. She was a viral spectacle of fraud, broadcasting her absolute ruin to hundreds of thousands of strangers. Guests surged out of their crystal chairs. Some scrambled toward the main mahogany doors to escape the humiliation and distance themselves from the scandal, while others pushed forward, eager to capture every humiliating second of the disaster for their own social media feeds. The venture capitalists and wealthy socialites my parents had tried so hard to impress were now pointing, whispering, and sneering openly at the spectacle. The pristine white floral arrangements lining the aisle were knocked over in the crush of panicked bodies, trampling the imported white orchids into the carpet. At the altar, the sheer gravity of his public ruin finally pierced Darnell's paralysis. His eyes darted wildly around the grand hall, calculating his non-existent odds of survival. He knew the presentation blazing on the massive LED screen behind him was not just a vicious social execution. It was a digital, high-definition confession of multiple federal crimes. The forged subprime mortgage application, the documented wire fraud, and the staggering underground gambling debts were all out in the open for the world to scrutinize. He looked down at Madison, who was sobbing uncontrollably on the floor, reaching a desperate, trembling hand up toward him for comfort. Darnell did not help her. He did not even look at her twice. His survival instinct kicked in with ruthless, selfish clarity. He shoved violently past his own best man, knocking the bewildered groomsman directly into a towering glass vase filled with water and floating blossoms. The heavy glass shattered violently against the marble steps, spraying water and sharp shards across the altar. Darnell leaped over the dangerous debris, ignoring the shocked shouts of the remaining wedding party. He made a desperate sprint and break for the discreet side exit located near the catering prep area. His frantic plan was to slip out through the busy kitchens, steal a valet car from the back lot, and vanish into the city before the ruthless Indiana bookies or anyone else could connect the dots and hunt him down. He made it exactly 5 steps down the dimly lit side corridor before a new sound sliced through the angry shouting in the grand hall. It was the sharp, terrifying wail of approaching police sirens. The noise echoed harshly off the thick glass walls of the luxury venue, rapidly multiplying in volume as multiple cruisers swarmed the cobblestone driveway outside. Flashing red and blue lights illuminated the floor-to-ceiling windows, painting the frantic wedding guests and the ruined floral displays in the harsh, unforgiving colors of a crime scene. I had not just made a spectacular financial presentation to ruin their big day. I had not simply hacked an unprotected audio-visual system to embarrass them in front of their wealthy friends. 3 days prior, while my family was busy popping champagne and celebrating their hostile takeover of my stolen mansion, I had walked directly into the Financial Crimes Division of the Chicago Police Department headquarters. I did not arrive empty-handed with vague accusations. I submitted a massive, irrefutable portfolio of hard evidence. The thick binder I handed to the lead detective contained tracked IP addresses, verified bank routing numbers, the explicitly forged digital signatures on the subprime loan, and the exact timestamps of Darnell transferring illicit funds across state lines. I laid out a flawless, legally binding map of severe identity theft and massive wire fraud. The detectives took one look at the pristine, undeniable trail of evidence I provided and immediately fast-tracked a felony arrest warrant. They knew exactly where the suspect would be, standing on Saturday afternoon, dressed in a tailored tuxedo, conveniently surrounded by witnesses. Darnell slammed his body weight against the heavy side exit doors, but the catering staff, realizing a massive scandal and potential danger was unfolding in the main hall, had instinctively engaged the deadbolts on the secondary exits to prevent a stampede. Darnell rattled the heavy brass handles, cursing violently and kicking the solid wood. He spun around, breathing heavily, completely trapped in the narrow hallway between the locked kitchens and the chaotic main reception room. The grand wooden doors at the front of the venue suddenly burst open with tremendous force. A heavily armed squad of uniformed Chicago police officers, accompanied by 2 stern plainclothes detectives, marched into the chaotic room. Their sudden, authoritative presence instantly silenced the shouting guests. The officers moved with absolute, terrifying purpose. They did not care about the ruined white orchids, the spilled champagne, or the crying bride collapsed on the floor. They fanned out rapidly, securing every visible exit and scanning the massive room. One of the lead detectives held up a printed photograph scanning the crowd until he locked eyes with the fleeing groom hiding in the corridor. Darnell pressed his back flat against the locked exit doors, his chest heaving in absolute defeat as the officers drew their weapons and firmly ordered him to the ground. Up at the front of the room, Susan and Richard clung to each other in sheer, unadulterated terror, realizing they had drained their life savings to fund this criminal right up until the exact moment the metal handcuffs came out. Sitting in my quiet hotel suite, I watched the live camera feed with a cold smile as the police officers firmly tackled Darnell to the carpet, securing his wrists tightly behind his back. The trap I meticulously built had finally snapped completely shut. The officers hauled Darnell up from the carpet by his tailored lapels, dragging him roughly toward the center of the room. To ensure he possessed no concealed weapons, a burly detective shoved Darnell face first against a tall glass-topped cocktail table positioned near the front row. The violent impact sent a stunning cascade of crystal champagne flutes and silver trays shattering onto the polished marble floor. The sharp, metallic click of heavy handcuffs, snapping securely around his wrists, echoed fiercely through the grand hall, captured flawlessly by the venue's professional microphones. The lead detective loudly recited his Miranda rights, meticulously detailing the severe felony charges of wire fraud, grand larceny, and identity theft. Every single damning word was broadcast clearly to the 300,000 viewers still glued to the live stream. Seeing their pristine social standing completely obliterated in a matter of seconds, Susan and Richard snapped. The thin, fragile veneer of their 30-year marriage, a union built entirely on shallow vanity and shared delusions of grandeur, violently shattered. Right there in the front row, mere inches away from the trembling priest and the weeping bride, they turned on each other with the ferocity of starved animals. Susan lunged at Richard, slapping his shoulder frantically with her manicured hands. She screamed that this catastrophic humiliation was entirely his fault, shrieking that a real father would have hired private investigators and thoroughly vetted Darnell's background before letting a criminal anywhere near their family. She wailed that his incompetence had destroyed her reputation forever. Richard did not cower or back down. His face turned a dangerous purple shade of rage, fueled by the crushing weight of his absolute, irreversible bankruptcy. He roared right back into her face, his voice booming over the chaos. He bellowed that Darnell was Susan's hand-picked prize, a stylish prop she desperately wanted to show off at the country club to make her friends jealous. He screamed that her toxic obsession with Instagram aesthetics and fake wealth had literally bankrupted them. He pointed a shaking finger at the exit, reminding her violently that just 20 minutes ago he had been forced to drain his entire pension and hand over the deeds to their cars to violent bookies just to keep her precious aesthetic intact. He yelled that her vanity had driven away Clara, the only daughter, who actually cared about their survival, leaving them with absolutely nothing but a mountain of debt and a criminal son-in-law. The 500 elite guests, the venture capitalists, the corporate lawyers, and the influential society wives were absolutely mesmerized by the grotesque spectacle unfolding before them. They did not intervene to break up the fight. They did not offer a single word of comfort to the weeping bride. Instead, they pulled out their smartphones, zooming in on my parents' vicious screaming match. Malicious whispers tore through the well-dressed crowd like a virus. The very people Susan had spent decades trying to impress the elite circle she had sacrificed me to join were now actively documenting her total destruction. It was the ultimate, inescapable social execution. 3 weeks later, the fallout from the catastrophic wedding was absolute and merciless. Darnell was sitting in a cramped concrete cell in the Cook County Jail. Bail had been immediately denied due to his severe flight risk and the staggering mountain of federal wire fraud evidence I had meticulously handed to the detectives. There were no tailored suits or counterfeit watches in lockup. He was wearing an oversized orange jumpsuit completely stripped of his arrogant bravado. He spent his days terrified, knowing that the violent bookies from suburban Indiana had extensive reach and were waiting for him to either make a mistake behind bars or get released. His grand illusion of being a wealthy streetwear executive was dead replaced by the grim reality of a federal indictment that carried a minimum sentence of 15 years. Madison experienced a completely different, but equally devastating kind of imprisonment. The internet, the exact audience she had worshipped and prioritized over her own family, completely turned on her with savage efficiency. The hashtag #FraudBride did not just trend for a single weekend. It became a permanent, relentless cultural joke. Major cosmetics and fashion brands dropped her, instantly issuing harsh public statements to frantically distance themselves from her criminal associations. The sheer volume of mockery, death threats, and brutal cancel culture backlash forced her to permanently delete every single one of her social media accounts. She was entirely erased from the digital world. Without her sponsorships and online validation, she had absolutely no income, no identity, and zero marketable skills. She spent her days hiding, terrified to even walk down the street, paranoid that strangers would recognize her from the viral videos of her collapsing at the altar. Susan and Richard faced the most brutal reality check of all. Having impulsively drained their entire retirement pension and signed over the pink slips to their luxury cars to buy Darnell's temporary safety, they were officially destitute. Their bank accounts were completely empty. Without my silent monthly infusions of cash, they could not pay the exorbitant rent on their upscale suburban townhouse. The property management company, already aware of the massive public scandal, showed absolutely no mercy. The eviction notice was served swiftly. With their credit scores annihilated by their recent reckless financial maneuvers, no reputable landlord in the city of Chicago would approve them for a new lease. They were forced to pack whatever belongings they could fit into a cheap, dented rental van. The country club friends they had spent decades trying to impress completely ghosted them. Nobody offered a spare bedroom. Nobody offered a short-term loan. When Susan desperately called her wealthy socialite friends begging for help, her calls went straight to voicemail. They were social pariahs, completely radioactive to the elite circles they used to worship. The humiliation of carrying cardboard boxes out of their luxury rental, while their former neighbors watched from behind drawn blinds, broke Susan's spirit completely. They had only one place left to go. Years ago, before they fully committed to their delusion of grandeur and began draining my bank accounts, we lived in a modest, working-class neighborhood on the far south side of the city. They had sold that original childhood home to finance their initial leap into high society. However, the property had recently fallen into severe disrepair. A real estate developer had bought it, went completely bankrupt, and left the house to rot in a messy, stalled foreclosure process. It was currently sitting entirely vacant, a dilapidated shell of a building surrounded by overgrown weeds and chain-link fencing. It was highly illegal to squat in a foreclosed property, but extreme desperation breeds necessity. The rented moving van sputtered to a halt in front of the broken, cracked concrete driveway. The Chicago sky was heavily overcast, casting a miserable, freezing gray light over the rotting wooden porch and the shattered front windows. Susan stepped out of the passenger seat, her worn-out designer shoes sinking deep into the muddy, unkempt lawn. She looked up at the crumbling roof and let out a harsh, defeated sob. The physical decay of the house perfectly mirrored the absolute ruin of her social standing. Richard killed the van's engine. He did not speak. He just stared blankly at the steering wheel. His face aged 10 years in the span of 3 weeks. Madison sat in the back of the van, wearing a faded gray sweatshirt, staring blankly at the dirty floorboards. The golden child was entirely stripped of her shine, reduced to a hollow, silent ghost who jumped at every loud noise. They trudged up the broken concrete walkway carrying heavy taped cardboard boxes. Richard forced the rusty front door open easily, snapping the cheap padlock the bank had installed months ago. The interior of the house was a waking nightmare. The air was incredibly thick with the smell of mildew, stale dust, and rotting wood. The floorboards were severely warped, and massive brown water stains covered the peeling ceiling. There was no electricity, no running water, and absolutely no luxury. The chill of the impending Chicago winter had already settled deeply into the bones of the house. They set their boxes down in the center of the dusty, darkened living room. Susan collapsed onto a plastic storage crate, burying her face in her dirty hands. She wept openly, mourning the permanent death of her socialite persona. Richard leaned heavily against the peeling wallpaper, too physically and mentally exhausted to even attempt to comfort his wife. Madison stood shivering in the corner, wrapping her arms tightly around herself to ward off the damp chill of the abandoned house. They were utterly broken. They had gleefully sacrificed their loyal daughter, their financial security, and their entire future just to protect a superficial, fraudulent lie. Now the lie was dead, and they were trapped in the decaying ruins of the past they had tried so desperately to escape. Exhausted and defeated, they looked around the barren room, realizing they had absolutely nothing left but each other. And as the freezing wind rattled the broken window frames, they silently hated each other for it. As the freezing wind rattled the broken window frames, they silently hated each other for it. The heavy silence in the decaying living room was suffocating. Every creak of the settling house felt like a physical blow to their shattered egos. Richard slowly lowered his cardboard box onto the warped floorboards, the cardboard scraping harshly against the grit and grime. He looked around the space that had once been the starting point of their family decades ago. Back then, it was a modest but warm home. Now stripped of basic maintenance and left to rot by a bankrupt developer, it was a literal manifestation of their moral decay. The walls were stained with creeping black mold. The air was incredibly stale, thick with the smell of abandonment and damp earth. Susan stood frozen near the front entryway, her expensive silk blouse offering absolutely no protection against the biting Chicago cold, cutting through the shattered window panes. She refused to put her designer bags down on the filthy floor. She clutched them to her chest like a shield, her eyes darting frantically around the barren room, as if she expected the walls to close in and crush her. There was no golden child privilege left to protect her. There was no luxury, no pride, and no country club audience to impress. The absolute reality of their poverty hit her with the force of a physical strike. She was a 58-year-old woman with no money, no home, and a reputation so completely destroyed that she could not even show her face at the local grocery store. Madison wandered numbly deeper into the shadows of the living room. Her oversized gray sweatshirt swallowed her fragile frame. She dragged her feet, her expensive sneakers catching on the splintered wood. She looked like a ghost, haunting the ruins of a life she threw away. She approached the old brick fireplace, the only structural element in the room that had not completely caved in. The hearth was filled with years of accumulated trash and dead leaves blown down through the open chimney. But as Madison raised her head, her sunken eyes locked onto something that absolutely did not belong in this decaying wasteland. Sitting perfectly in the dead center of the dusty wooden mantelpiece was a single, pristine object. It was a thick, heavy manila envelope. The paper was high quality, completely free of the grime and moisture that covered every other inch of the house. It was sealed on the back with a thick, blood-red wax stamp. The edges of the envelope were perfectly aligned, placed with a meticulous, calculating precision that sent an immediate shiver down Madison's spine. Mom Madison whispered, her voice hoarse and trembling. "Dad? Look at this." Susan and Richard snapped out of their miserable trances. They stepped cautiously across the rotting floorboards, moving toward the fireplace, as if the envelope were a live explosive. Richard squinted in the dim gray light filtering through the dirty windows. He leaned in closer, his breath catching in his throat as he recognized the script written across the front of the envelope. It was Clara's handwriting. There was no mistaking the elegant, razor-sharp, perfectly slanted cursive. It was the exact same handwriting that had signed the checks funding their luxurious lifestyle for years. It was the same handwriting that had signed the promissory note destroying Darnell. Written clearly across the center of the heavy manila paper were their three names: Richard, Susan, and Madison. "She was here!" Susan gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "She knew we would end up here. She planned this! How could she possibly know we would come back to this awful place?" Richard stared at the wax seal. a sickening dread pooling in his empty stomach. Clara did not just predict their eviction. She orchestrated their entire descent. She knew that without her money, they would exhaust their options in a matter of weeks. She knew their pride would prevent them from asking distant relatives for help. She knew this foreclosed, abandoned property was the only physical shelter they had left in the entire state of Illinois. She had walked into this rotting house, placed the envelope on the mantelpiece, and waited for the trap to spring. "Open it," Richard commanded, his voice barely a whisper. His hands were shaking too violently to do it himself. He fully expected the envelope to contain a final, devastating lawsuit. He braced himself for a legal document suing them for emotional distress, or perhaps a restraining order, ensuring they could never legally contact her again. Madison reached out her fingers, trembling wildly. She hesitated for an agonizing second, terrified that breaking the crimson wax seal would unleash another wave of catastrophic humiliation. She expected a letter filled with pure, concentrated hatred. She expected photographs of Darnell in a jail cell, or screenshots of the brutal online mockery that had driven her into hiding. She swallowed hard, pushing past the terror. She slid her fingernail under the flap and ripped the heavy paper open. The wax seal snapped loudly in the quiet room. Madison reached inside the thick envelope. Her fingers brushed against a stack of heavy, textured parchment paper. She pulled the documents out, clutching them tightly in her hands. The top page was a formal legal cover sheet embossed with the gold seal of a highly prestigious downtown Chicago law firm. Susan leaned over Madison's shoulder, her eyes wide with frantic anticipation. Richard stepped closer, holding his breath. Madison's eyes scanned the first few lines of the heavily formatted text. She did not find a lawsuit. She did not find a restraining order. She did not find a gloating letter of hatred. Instead, the color drained completely from Madison's face. Her jaw dropped open in absolute, unadulterated shock. The document in her trembling hands was a certified, notarized property deed, and it was not a deed for this rotting foreclosed house. It was a deed for a breathtaking, ultra-luxury real estate property. Madison read the address printed in bold black ink, her mind struggling to process the impossible information. The address belonged to one of the most exclusive, expensive residential skyscrapers in the heart of downtown Chicago. The reality of what Clara had left them on the dusty mantelpiece was far more shocking and devastating than any lawsuit could have ever been. The deed is fully exclusively in Clara's name, but the accompanying paperwork details the origin of the funds. Madison stared at the thick, embossed paper, her eyes scanning the bold type at the top of the page. It was a certified property deed for a breathtaking $1.2 million luxury penthouse located in the absolute heart of downtown Chicago. Attached to the deed was a glossy, high-definition real estate brochure showcasing the property. It featured panoramic floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Michigan, a private rooftop terrace, custom Italian marble countertops, and an exclusive private elevator that opened directly into the foyer. Susan let out a sharp, hysterical gasp. A sudden, desperate surge of hope flooded her chest, completely erasing the misery of the rotting, abandoned house around them. She grabbed Richard's arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging deeply into his worn jacket. "Richard, she bought it for us!" Susan cried out, her voice vibrating with delusional joy. "Clara bought us a penthouse! She forgave us! She saw how much we suffered with the Darnell scandal, and she is fixing it! I knew she would not let her own family live on the streets. She is apologizing to us." Richard felt a massive, crushing weight lift off his shoulders. He reached for the paperwork, tears of pure relief welling in his tired, bloodshot eyes. He envisioned the private elevator, the luxury amenities, and the immediate restoration of his country club status. He thought Clara had finally returned to her rightful place as their obedient, reliable bank account, ready to sweep their catastrophic viral mistakes under $1 million rug. He was already planning how to explain this massive upgrade to his former wealthy friends. But as Madison flipped to the second page of the heavy legal packet, the blood drained entirely from her face. Her hands began to shake with a violent, uncontrollable tremor. She did not find a letter of apology. She did not find a transfer of ownership or a set of brass keys to the penthouse. Mom Madison whispered, her voice cracking into a dry, terrified wheeze. "This is not for us." Susan snatched the paperwork out of Madison's hands, her desperate smile freezing in place. She quickly scanned the dense legal text, searching frantically for her own name. She read the grantee section of the deed. The property belonged entirely, exclusively, and irrevocably to Clara. There were no co-signers. There were no trust provisions allowing my parents to reside there. There was no safety net. It was my absolute, legally protected domain. Then Susan flipped to the third page, and her knees physically buckled. She dropped to the dusty floorboards, the heavy parchment paper scattering across the dirt. Richard scrambled to pick them up, holding the documents up to the gray light filtering through the shattered windows. It was a certified statement of estate execution and a massive trust fund disbursement record. The documents detailed the exact origin of the funds used to purchase the $1 million penthouse in cash. The money did not come from my tech salary. It did not come from my personal stock portfolio. The massive influx of wealth originated from the estate of Arthur Susan's estranged older brother. For 3 decades, my parents and Madison had treated Uncle Arthur like an absolute pariah. He lived quietly in a small, unassuming cabin in upstate Wisconsin. He drove a rusted 20-year-old truck, wore thrift store flannel shirts, and had absolutely no interest in the superficial country club aesthetic my mother worshipped. Susan was profoundly embarrassed by him. She actively mocked his modest lifestyle to her wealthy friends, calling him a penniless eccentric who lacked the ambition to make anything of himself. Richard banned him from attending family holidays, claiming his cheap clothes and quiet demeanor ruined their perfect social image. Madison openly laughed at the handmade wooden toys he used to send her for her birthdays, tossing them directly into the trash while demanding expensive electronics. They completely isolated him, treating him with the exact same ruthless, shallow cruelty they eventually turned on me. I was the only person in the family who ever bothered to drive up to Wisconsin to visit him. I spent my holidays sitting on his worn porch, listening to his stories, and treating him with the basic human decency my parents severely lacked. When his health began to fail 2 years ago, I secretly paid for his specialized medical care and visited him in the hospital every single weekend. Uncle Arthur passed away quietly 12 months before Madison's disastrous wedding. My parents did not even bother to attend the funeral, citing a scheduling conflict with a luxury wine tasting event. They assumed he died with nothing but a mountain of medical debt and a rotting cabin in the woods. The legal documents, scattered on the floor of the foreclosed house, revealed the catastrophic reality of their arrogance. Uncle Arthur was not a penniless eccentric. He was a quiet, fiercely intelligent investor who had purchased massive tracts of undeveloped commercial land in the 1980s. He had lived frugally, silently, amassing a staggering 8-figure fortune. He was a secret multi-millionaire. The estate execution document Richard was holding detailed the massive scope of the inheritance. There were heavily diversified stock portfolios, commercial real estate holdings in rapidly developing tech corridors, and several highly lucrative offshore accounts. The total net worth of the estate exceeded $25 million, and according to the bold, notarized text of Uncle Arthur's final will and testament, he left every single cent, every property, and every asset exclusively to me. Richard read the total net worth figure out loud. His voice, sounding like a hollow, broken echo in the barren room. 25 million, he choked out, dropping the paper as if it had physically burned his hands. $25 million! The will explicitly stated that Uncle Arthur was fully aware of Susan and Richard's superficial cruelty. He included a specific, brutal clause noting that his sister Susan was to receive absolutely nothing due to her lifelong vanity and total abandonment of her family in pursuit of social climbing. The document legally barred them from contesting the will, citing decades of documented estrangement. I was named the sole, uncontested heir to the entire empire. Susan clawed at the dirty floorboards, her manicured nails breaking against the rough wood. She gathered the papers, reading the numbers over and over again, completely unable to process the magnitude of her loss. She let out a long, agonizing wail that tore through the decaying house. It was not a cry of sadness for her deceased brother. It was a scream of pure, agonizing financial grief. The realization hit her with the destructive force of a nuclear bomb. While she was busy draining her own pension to fund a fraudulent streetwear executive while she was screaming at me for demanding my $65,000 back, I was already sitting on a completely untouchable $25 million empire. The wealth she had spent her entire miserable life chasing, the ultimate luxury she had sacrificed her own daughter to simulate, had been sitting quietly in her own brother's bank accounts all along. She had abandoned her brother because his truck was rusty, completely ignorant of the fact that he could have bought her entire country club in cash. Richard slumped against the moldy wall, hyperventilating, as a massive panic attack fully set in. He had traded $25 million in generational wealth for Darnell's fake designer watches and a mountain of predatory debt. Madison stared blankly at the wall, her mind totally shattered. The penthouse, the private elevator, the absolute financial freedom it all, belonged to the sister she had just publicly banished from the family. They were standing in a freezing, rotting, foreclosed house with $0 to their name, staring at the exact proof of the breathtaking fortune they had permanently lost because of their own repulsive vanity. The heavy silence in the foreclosed house was broken only by the sound of Madison shuffling the remaining pages of the legal packet. She pulled a thick, cream-colored envelope from the bottom of the stack. It was unsealed, bearing the official letterhead of the estate executor. Madison pulled out a crisp typed letter, but the signature at the bottom was handwritten in the shaky, unmistakable scrawl of her deceased Uncle Arthur. She began reading the letter aloud, her voice trembling violently, echoing off the moldy walls of their ruined shelter. The letter was not just a legal formality. It was a posthumous reckoning, a brutal, itemized exposure of their lifelong arrogance. Arthur detailed the exact scope of the massive 8-figure trust fund he had quietly established. The portfolio was staggering. Madison read out the line items one by one, each word acting like a physical blow to her parents. There were controlling shares in a highly profitable Midwestern logistics firm. There were commercial real estate holdings in downtown Manhattan and luxury ski chalets in Aspen, Colorado. There were municipal bonds generating hundreds of thousands of dollars in passive, tax-free interest every single month. The sheer, overwhelming scale of the generational wealth was incomprehensible. Susan covered her ears completely, unable to handle the agonizing truth, but Madison kept reading, compelled by a sick, masochistic need to understand exactly what they had thrown away. The letter shifted from financial disclosures to deeply personal memories. Arthur specifically addressed his sister Susan. He recounted the exact day she banned him from attending Madison's high school graduation. He wrote about how Susan had called him a penniless embarrassment, explicitly telling him that his rusted pickup truck and cheap boots would ruin the aesthetic of their family photos. He recalled the Thanksgiving dinner 20 years ago when Richard openly mocked his modest cabin, calling him a failure who lacked the drive to succeed in a modern economy. Arthur wrote that he had quietly walked out of their suburban home that night, vowing never to expose himself to their toxic, superficial judgments again. He let them believe their own arrogant narrative. He let them believe they were the wealthy ones, simply because they wore their debt like a designer suit. But the letter did not just condemn my parents. It elevated me. Arthur's words shifted into a profound emotional testament to the daughter they had spent a lifetime treating like a burden. While Susan and Richard were busy maxing out their credit cards to fund Madison's fake influencer lifestyle I was living, a completely different reality. Arthur revealed that for the last 10 years, I was the only family member who ever reached out to him. While my parents were attending luxury wine tastings, I was driving 5 hours deep into rural Wisconsin every single weekend. I chopped his firewood before the harsh winters set in. I bought his groceries. I sat on his worn-out porch and listened to his stories about our ancestors treating him with the basic human dignity my parents completely lacked. The most devastating revelation for Susan and Richard came when Arthur detailed his final 2 years of life. When the pancreatic cancer struck, he was completely alone. He did not call his sister, knowing she would only complain about the inconvenience. He called me. Arthur wrote that I immediately took a leave of absence from my demanding corporate job. I organized his entire medical care plan, paying for private nurses out of my own pocket, completely unaware that he had the funds to buy the entire hospital. I drove him to every single chemotherapy appointment. I sat in the sterile hospital rooms for hours, holding his hand while he slept, never once asking for a single dime or a word of gratitude. I did it simply because he was family, and because I genuinely loved him. Arthur explicitly stated that he maintained his facade of poverty until his absolute final breath. He wanted to ensure that the person who stood by him did so out of pure, unadulterated loyalty, not financial greed. I passed his silent, ultimate test perfectly. Because of my unwavering compassion, he quietly contacted his team of wealth managers and completely restructured his entire empire. He left his entire fortune, every single property, every stock, and every liquid asset exclusively to me. Richard scrambled across the dirty floorboards, snatching the final page of the trust document from Madison's hands. He needed to see the timeline. He needed to know exactly when this monumental transfer of wealth had occurred. His bloodshot eyes scanned the notarized dates stamped at the bottom of the page. The breath rushed out of his lungs in a sharp, painful hiss. The estate had been fully settled and dispersed exactly 1 year ago. The realization hit Richard with the force of a speeding train. For an entire year, I had been a multimillionaire. While they were treating me like an obedient, disposable bank account demanding I pay for their leased cars and premium health insurance, I was already sitting on an 8-figure empire. When I fronted the $65,000 deposit for Madison's luxury wedding venue, I was not dipping into my life savings. I was using a fraction of the interest my trust fund generated in a single afternoon. I had the power to buy them a fleet of luxury cars in cash to pay off Darnell's violent bookies without blinking, and to elevate their social standing to heights they could not even comprehend. Richard looked at Susan, his face twisted in absolute, soul-crushing horror. The memory of the bridal boutique replayed violently in his mind. He remembered standing in that vanilla-scented room, aggressively puffing out his chest and threatening to formally disown me. He remembered Susan calling me a jealous, bitter spinster. He remembered Madison screaming at me to disappear from their family forever. They had looked a $25 million heiress right in the eyes, a woman who held the absolute power to secure their legacy for generations, and they told her she was completely worthless. They chose a broke, criminal scammer wearing a counterfeit watch over a fiercely loyal daughter holding the keys to an actual kingdom. The sheer, terrifying magnitude of their mistake was inescapable. They were completely ruined, sitting in a freezing, rotting house, fully aware that their salvation had been standing right in front of them the entire time, and they had viciously, permanently slammed the door in her face. Richard stared at the dirty floorboards, hyperventilating, as the terrifying magnitude of their mistake crushed his spirit. They were completely ruined, sitting in a freezing, rotting house, fully aware that their salvation had been standing right in front of them, and they had viciously slammed the door in her face. But the agonizing revelations were not quite finished. Madison, her hands completely numb and trembling against the bitter cold, reached into the empty manila envelope one last time. Her fingers brushed against a heavily bonded piece of paper, stuck tightly to the interior lining. She pulled it out slowly. It was a formal addendum from the primary estate lawyer, printed on thick, watermarked stationery. This was not an emotional letter. It was a clinical, razor-sharp, legal memorandum addressed directly to Susan Richard and Madison. Madison cleared her dry throat, her voice barely a whisper as she began to read the unforgiving legal text aloud to her shattered parents. The lawyer broke down the final, brutal mechanics of the inheritance with absolute precision. Uncle Arthur had not just left me a massive fortune. He had deliberately weaponized it to expose the family's true nature. The document revealed a highly specific conditional clause built directly into the foundational trust. Arthur knew that suddenly acquiring tens of millions of dollars could be an isolating burden. He wanted to give his sister and her family one final, definitive opportunity for redemption. The clause stated that if the family demonstrated genuine love, unconditional respect, and unselfish support to me during a designated probationary period, I was legally authorized and fully empowered to divide the massive estate equally among all four of us. The wealth could have been legally shared. The trust was structured to seamlessly absorb their debts, purchase them luxury estates, and elevate their social standing beyond their wildest, most greedy imaginations. All they had to do was treat me like a human being. The probationary period was set for exactly 1 year following Arthur's death. During that entire 12-month window, I had purposefully hidden my new billionaire status. I went to work every day. I drove my standard car. I continued to act as their reliable, unappreciated financial safety net. I quietly paid the venue deposits, covered the premium car leases, and absorbed their constant verbal abuse, waiting patiently to see if they would ever even once choose me over their own vanity. I gave them every conceivable opportunity to show a shred of genuine affection. The estate lawyer's letter clinically documented the precise timeline of my test. It noted that the final deadline for the probationary period coincided exactly with the week of Madison's wedding. Susan let out a strangled, breathless gasp, her hands gripping her hair. She realized the horrifying truth. The wedding was not just a social event. It was the final exam of their lives, and they had failed it spectacularly. The lawyer's memorandum continued detailing the specific legal triggers of the forfeiture clause. If the family committed any act of severe emotional abuse, financial extortion, or formal alienation during the probationary year, my authorization to share the wealth would be permanently revoked. The trust would legally lock them out forever, ensuring not a single cent of Arthur's money could ever be utilized to fund their superficial delusions. Madison read the final damning paragraph of the lawyer's letter. It cited a specific date and time. It was the exact Tuesday afternoon inside the luxury bridal boutique on the Magnificent Mile. The document clinically described the confrontation. It explicitly referenced Madison demanding that I disappear from the family forever as her ultimate wedding gift. It documented Susan looking away in passive agreement and Richard threatening formal disownment over a $65,000 deposit. By issuing that vicious ultimatum and extorting me to fund Darnell's fake lifestyle the family had activated the irrevocable forfeiture clause. The lawyer's words were absolute. The memorandum stated that as of that Tuesday afternoon, Susan Richard and Madison had legally, permanently, and irrevocably forfeited any and all future claims to the Arthur estate. The decision was ironclad. There were no appeals, no loopholes, and no secondary chances. The wealth was entirely sealed away from them for the rest of eternity. The heavy paper slipped from Madison's trembling fingers, fluttering silently down to the rotting wooden floorboards. The absolute silence in the abandoned house was deafening. No one screamed. The sheer gravity of their self-inflicted destruction was far too massive for tears. They had literally held the winning lottery ticket to an unimaginably luxurious future. I had been ready and willing to split an empire with them. If they had simply thanked me for buying the veil, if they had simply shown a fraction of gratitude for the venue deposit, or if they had just defended me against Darnell's arrogant insults, they would be sitting in a multi-million-dollar penthouse right now, completely immune to financial worry for the rest of their natural lives. Instead, they chose to protect a fraud. They chose to blindly worship a broke, addicted gambler simply because he wore tailored suits and pretended to be part of the elite. They had thrown away a legitimate dynastic fortune just to protect a pathetic illusion. They had sacrificed a billionaire daughter to appease a criminal. The bitter, freezing wind howled through the shattered window panes of the foreclosed living room, chilling them to their very bones. They were completely trapped in the dark, destitute prison they had built with their own bare hands, forced to live out the rest of their miserable days, knowing that their boundless greed and shallow vanity had cost them absolutely everything they ever wanted in this entire world. A price so steep, it broke their very souls. The heavy paper slipped from Madison's trembling fingers, fluttering silently down to the rotting wooden floorboards to join the rest of their shattered reality. The silence inside the decaying living room was absolute, a suffocating void created by the sudden, violent death of their entire future. They stood paralyzed in the freezing shadows, unable to speak, unable to weep, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of their monumental mistake. Then, a sharp rhythmic sound sliced through the howling Chicago wind. It was the distinct, unmistakable click of designer heels striking against polished stone. The sound was entirely foreign to the abandoned, overgrown street, echoing with a crisp, commanding authority that immediately shattered their trance. It was a sound that belonged to the world they had just been permanently exiled from. Driven by a desperate, pathetic curiosity, Susan Richard and Madison turned away from the fireplace. They shuffled across the warped floorboards, their shoes crunching on the grit and broken glass, and rushed to the shattered bay windows overlooking the front yard. They wiped the thick layer of grime from the surviving glass panes, peering out into the gray, freezing afternoon. What they saw completely stole the remaining breath from their lungs. When they arrived at the foreclosed property an hour ago, they were too blinded by their own misery and panic to notice their immediate surroundings. Now, looking out through the broken window frame, they saw the stunning reality of the adjacent lot. The neighboring property, which had once held another dilapidated working-class home, had been completely leveled and transformed. In its place stood a breathtaking, sprawling masterpiece of modern architecture. It was a fortress of sheer glass, warm cedar accents and raw concrete, surrounded by a high, impenetrable security wall and immaculate heated terrace gardens that effortlessly defied the harsh winter frost. Standing perfectly still on the expansive, beautifully manicured balcony of that luxury estate was Clara. She looked absolutely magnificent. She was dressed impeccably in a tailored, camel-colored cashmere coat over a dark designer suit, projecting an aura of immense, quiet power. She did not look like the exhausted, unappreciated daughter they had treated like a walking ATM for decades. She looked like exactly what she was, a multi-million-dollar heiress who had just surgically dismantled her abusers. Richard pressed his trembling hands against the cold window frame, his eyes darting from the glowing modern estate back to the rotting porch of the foreclosed house they were standing in. He noticed a discreet heavy metal plaque bolted to the stone pillar of the neighboring estate's security gate. It bore the name of the exact same corporate holding company listed on the trust fund documents scattered on the floor behind him. The final, paralyzing realization clicked into place, hitting Richard with the destructive force of a physical blow. Clara had not just purchased a luxury penthouse downtown. She had used her vast, untouchable resources to anonymously purchase this entire block of properties. She had bought the newly developed estate next door, and she had intentionally purchased the bank-owned, foreclosed childhood home they were currently squatting in. She literally owned the collapsing roof over their heads and the frozen dirt beneath their feet. She was their landlord, their judge, and their executioner. Clara looked down at them from her elevated balcony. The physical height difference perfectly mirrored the new, permanent hierarchy of their lives. She did not yell. She did not wave her arms, and she did not gloat. She looked down at the family that had abused her with an absolute, untouchable serenity. The desperate need for their validation that had once anchored her to them was completely gone, replaced by a cold, brilliant peace. Slowly, Clara raised her right hand. Between her gloved fingers, she held a small, crisp rectangle of paper. She extended her arm over the polished glass railing of the balcony. With a simple, effortless flick of her wrist, she released it. The paper caught the freezing wind, fluttering gracefully through the bitter air, dancing over the property line before landing perfectly on the cracked concrete walkway right outside their broken window. Driven by a pathetic, lingering instinct for a financial handout, Richard pushed open the rotting front door. It groaned loudly on its rusted hinges as he stepped out into the biting cold. He stumbled down the broken porch stairs, bending his stiff knees to snatch the folded slip of paper from the frozen weeds. Madison and Susan crowded the doorway behind him, wrapping their arms around themselves, their breaths forming desperate white clouds in the frigid air. Richard unfolded the paper with shaking hands. It was a certified cashier's check. But it was not a bailout. It was not a gesture of forgiveness, and it was certainly not a ticket out of their misery. The check was made out for exactly $500. Richard's eyes dropped to the memo line, printed cleanly in the corner. For Darnell's jail commissary. It was the ultimate, humiliating insult. It was a microscopic fraction of her unimaginable wealth tossed into the dirt to feed the criminal they had chosen over her. It highlighted exactly how pathetic, powerless, and broke they truly were. Richard crushed the check in his fist, his shoulders shaking with a mixture of profound shame and absolute defeat. Susan stepped out onto the edge of the rotting porch, her ruined designer shoes sinking into the damp wood. She looked up at the stunning, glowing balcony, her face twisted in a mask of pure agony. She looked directly into Clara's eyes, silently begging for a mercy she knew she absolutely did not deserve. Clara met her mother's horrified, tear-filled eyes. The silence between them stretched for a long, heavy moment, carrying the weight of 30 years of emotional neglect and a single defining week of absolute justice. When Clara finally spoke, she did not need to raise her voice. The perfect acoustics of the quiet, empty street carried her words clearly, cutting through the winter wind like a surgical blade. "Thank you for telling me to disappear," Clara said, her voice smooth, effortless, and entirely devoid of regret. It was the only way I could find the world I actually belonged in. Without waiting for a response, without offering a single second of hesitation or a backward glance, Clara turned around. She walked away from the glass railing, stepping through the massive sliding doors into the warm, golden light of her magnificent home. The heavy doors glided shut behind her with a soft, final seal, locking the freezing cold and her toxic family out entirely. Susan collapsed to her knees on the filthy porch, her agonizing wails echoing uselessly down the empty street. Madison covered her face, weeping bitterly into her dirty, oversized sleeves as the reality of her erased future crushed her. Richard stood in the frozen weeds, clutching the $500 check, staring up at the glowing fortress he could never, ever enter. They were completely locked out of paradise, left utterly alone in the freezing dark ruins of their own making.